Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Veleno, Quanto, Basta channel. This interview will be recorded and published by our channel and by South Front. Today, for the second time, we have the honor to have with us Mr. Martin Armstrong, one of the most famous economists all over the world, a free voice talking about economy. With us, for the second time again, Lorenzo Maria Pacini, a friend of mine. The world is changing in time, and we have the opportunity to have a new storytelling and try to understand what's really happening from different point of view, by an economical point of view, a geopolitical point of view, and a philosophical point of view. So for me, it's really an honor to introduce you Martin Armstrong and Lorenzo Maria Pacini. Lorenzo, forgive me, but the first question will be for Mr. Armstrong. I'd like that we create a free interview. So when you want to make some question to Mr. Armstrong, feel free to make your question. So we have to create the best opportunity for the people that follow us to try to understand what's happening in the world. To trust in us. The first question for you is coming directly from your site, armstrongeconomics.com. Sorry. You wrote about the crisis of debt government. The world share of the debt is around 326%. It's impossible to believe in that. I know that you write the real story, but in which way the country, the European country, the Western country, could pay this mountain of money?
Well, that's the problem. They have no intention of ever paying off the debt. They have really, primarily since World War II, they've just engaged in this borrowing year after year with no intention of paying anything back. Historically, that's how governments collapse. Because eventually what happens is that the interest expenditures push out everything else. And they consume the vast majority of the budget. Like this year, the interest expenditures in the United States are exceeding $1 trillion. The national debt was $1 trillion under Ronald Reagan in 1980. So it's not a sustainable system. And all Western governments are basically in the same boat with this. And then, ultimately, what our computer shows is that we will go through another sovereign debt crisis like historically has always happened. And then often, unfortunately, they use war as the excuse to default. Even the United States, the Revolutionary War, the Constitution said they would honor the debts of the Continental Congress. They never did. World War I, they defaulted on the debts, even Canada. This is just what they do. France is in its fifth republic, and each new government, we don't pay the debts of the last one. So, Spain became a serial defaulter. I think it was 7 times, starting in around 1570. They successfully took themselves from the richest country in Europe to, basically a third world status. But unfortunately, governments only really act in their own self-interest. They always just want to sustain their power. It has nothing to do with the people or anything else. And so, that's why you see, like with, in the United States, and why Trump won, because people know the government's gotten too big, too costly, too inefficient. But then those in the government fight back to keep their jobs, etc. You take NATO, same thing. This is systemic in all governments. All right. Once you create an agency, it will then fight to keep its funding and stay alive. I've seen the internal memos from NATO. NATO was very concerned that money was going to climate change and not to them. And they were actually, concerned. They said, how do we remain relevant? The only way they remain relevant is by constantly saying Russia's going to invade. So you need us. If there's world peace, then why you need NATO?
Last time, Mr. Armstrong, last time that we met, you told us that a sovereign debt crisis could develop a world war. Sovereign debt crisis means also the end of democracy, which is the time that we are living. Is it possible a world war?
Yes, at the end, around 2032. All right. But between here and there, the government will become more authoritarian. All of them will. Because they know they're losing power. You just had Schultz at Davos saying, we believe in free speech, but not for the far right, which is his opposition, So, this is a problem that you get historically. Just, look at all the different governments, whatever, throughout history. It's always the same issue. They will do whatever they have to retain power. There's a stela there on the island of Delos, which was the Temple of Apollo, which was an ancient central bank in Greece. And there's a stela there with a list of all the cities that defaulted on them, and that was 400 BC. So nothing's ever changed. It's always the same thing, and mainly because human nature doesn't change regardless of the century you're looking at. That's history.
Okay, Mr. Armstrong, thanks a lot. Lorenzo, Mr. Armstrong give us a lot of stuff we have to talk about. Now it's up to you, make your first question to Martin.
Yeah, thank you so much, Piero. Mr. Armstrong, I would like to continuing about Europe. How do you see the situation? We are arrived nowadays with the collapse of euro that was being planned as a currency directly connected and dependent to dollars and to sterling, of course. And what we see nowadays is that this collapse seems never ending. We had the collapse first of the European economics, but starting from Germany. And Germany was the most powerful, of course, except the United Kingdom, but it's out of European Union now, this after Brexit. So how do you see this collapse? Because this is something that has been planned for sure for such a long time. and rebuilding or restoring, if you would try to do that, it seems something pretty impossible, because nowadays in our banks there are no money, there is no liquidity, and banks are taking lots of time for investments, for helping also the most important corporations of Europe. So we can imagine how this is reflecting on the little companies. And this is directly connected to the leadership, not only of the United Kingdom, but of the United States, and to the hegemony of dollar. But with the defeat of the hegemony of dollar, what we are asking now is like, the last breaths before the final death of his body that was called European Union, that actually is no more alive. And we have to decide what we want to do with that. Which is your perspective on this? How do you see this situation? If, in your opinion, could be also possible to have to save something of the, let me say, old economic system of Europe, or not?
Well, when they were creating the euro, they did come to me. And I explained, okay, fine, how you create a currency and to compete with the dollar, etc., required that they consolidated all the debts of the member states. And Helmut Kohl out of Germany at the time, he took Germany into the euro, denied the people any right to vote. He said, before he died, he said he acted like a dictator. And had he allowed the German people to vote, they would have voted 7-3 against him. So his criteria was not to consolidate the debt, because that would appear like maybe we're bailing out Greece or something. So when I met with them, I explained, you'll never compete with a dollar in this fashion. And because everything they were saying was basically a lie. Oh, everybody will pay the same interest rate. They were comparing it to the US. I said, but no, you're not. If you don't have a consolidated national debt, the rest of the United States, yes, we have 50 states, but they all pay different interest rates depending upon their credit rating. That's what Europe will be. And I warned them that, fine, you're creating a single currency, but you're only going to shift the volatility to the bond market. So a trader before, if he was bearish on Italy, he would short the lira and buy the German mark. Today, they just do it in the bond market. It's the same thing. So I was told back in 98 that they just had to get the euro in first, and then they would worry about the debt later because of coal. But here we are, 2024, they still haven't dealt with the debt. And the problem becomes that we ended up in this socialistic philosophy post-war. And so politicians everywhere, they are basically bribing the people to stay in power. Vote for me and I'll take the money from this guy and give it to you, and consequently, all they have ever done is continued to borrow and build up the debt to stay in power. There is no intention of ever paying off the debt. It couldn't possibly be paid off anyhow. And so eventually, the system does collapse, and Russia. I mean, Russia, a lot of people don't realize, but Lenin was really initially creating Russia idea of following the United States. that each republic would retain its sovereignty and be independent. And what happened was he even wrote a letter, as you know, that Stalin, don't let Stalin secede me, and, it's been widely rumored in Russia that Stalin poisoned Lenin and seized power. And then what did he do? He's the one that really created the USSR. He usurped all the power, centralized control. And that's what brings things down. The best example from history of actually something working was the Roman Empire. What did they do? Yes, they conquered all these countries. Okay. However, they allowed them to keep their own culture, their own gods, etc. All right. And it was kind of like a common market. So if you were in France and you made vases or whatever, and you wanted to sell them to somebody in Syria, there were no trade restrictions. Taxation was maybe about 7%. It was beneficial to be part of the Roman Empire. That's why it lasted for 1,000 years. All right. What do? We put trade sanctions on, put in barriers, etc., under this Marxist theory that, we have to protect our local jobs. I mean, I think one of the better economists that were overlooked was David Ricardo. And he had some practical experience, and he came up with his theory of comparative advantage. You don't grow lettuce in Saudi Arabia. That's going to cost you $10 for a head of lettuce because you got to keep watering it, when you can buy it for 50 cents someplace else, right? So the whole thing about tariffs and things of this nature go against what Ricardo was saying. If China makes the little pink umbrellas to put in, cocktail drinks, fine. They do it cheaper than anybody else. What's the problem? You don't tell somebody else to make it locally and it costs $5, So, I mean, anytime you get into this centralized control of government, when you start dictating things down, you are basically, typically, you're basically, limiting your own lifespan. It just does not work. Even in the United States, during the election, there was somebody that complained to Camilla at one of her rallies about abortion. And her response was, "You're at the wrong rally." What that really shows you is that once we get in, we're going to be a dictator and we're going to do as I say. That's not democracy. That's not civilization. Civilization lasts and it forms when we all benefit. These sanctions on Russia, stupid. You want world peace? You create free trade. What happens then? The average Russian, making something, selling it to Europe or wherever, and their politicians want war, he's going to say, hey, knock this off. Vote them out because I'm going to lose business. Even in the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, declared that anybody that owed any businesses in the South weren't allowed to pay them. If you look at Rome, free trade created world peace. The Pax Romana that's the way to do this. When you start putting in sanctions, first of all, I know some people in Russia, and one friend of mine who is not political, even said to me, "Why do they hate us so much?" This is the way sanctions come across, that they know it's being done by an external force, not by Putin. Okay, so you're only making yourself look bad. And this theory that if we put sanctions on, it'll be so bad for Russians that they'll overthrow Putin. Well, okay, very nice, but maybe now you get a neocon who's going to really want war. It's a complicated situation, but
Mr. Armstrong, sorry to interrupt you, because you touched a point that is very essential by my point of view. So, considering the latest news, okay, President Donald Trump attacked the Brics geoeconomical partnership just a few hours ago, commenting badly about the Brics pay system. And Brics pay was one of the most important news of 2024. It has been the year of the Kazan summit of Brics. Pretty everywhere I've talked about this Brics system that, as you know, should be, rumors said should be based on 60% of gold standard, 40% of national currencies. But actually, what we know is that they did this kind of test with Brics pay just to pay the coffee at the summit and nothing else. But it's so curious that Trump attacked the Brics pay system pretty dead. We know he is aware about the fall of dollar, but how do you see this? It is political decision that is hiding something more, of course. And this could change the trade. You said one thing, I'm quoting you, that I really loved. That kind of free trade was making peace, and like a trade of peace. Mm-hmm. What we see now is that by the Eastern point of view, the trade of peace is something that has been developed and that is sponsored by Brics as the main economical partner, but not only Brics. I can think also to Eurasian Economic Union and more. And on the other side, we have this old ultra-liberal system based on the hegemony of dollar. But with the collapse of the so-called rules-based order, what we see is that now they need to find a deal, because without this deal, it's not only a theoretical problem, it would be a global issue for many countries like Europe first. As Italians, as Europeans, we know very well we're doing this experience since already more than 10 years. So how do you see this decision, and which, in your opinion, could really be the potential of this new tentative, we will see what will be in the end, system of Brics as an alternative to the hegemony of dollar?
Well, if we really look at what created Brics, it was the sanctions on Russia. In 2014, when Russia went into Crimea, that's when Obama went to Brics and said, we want you to remove them as a punishment. And Brics refused. So now what did they do? They replaced the head of Brics. They replaced the head of SWIFT. He went to SWIFT to say, take them out. And so they replaced the head of SWIFT in 2019. And he just does whatever he's told. So the Brics ends up, other countries began to see, if we don't do what the United States commands, then they can remove us. So the Brics really began more as geopolitical rather than economic. All right. And this whole idea initiated with Christine Lagarde when she was at the IMF. She went after tax havens and threatened to take them out of the SWIFT system unless they turned over people. She even did that to the Vatican. It was all about, we need money, we're collecting taxes, and these people are not paying. We want to know who they are. So now you've divided the world economy. I mean, it's very nice to sound the gold standard, things of this nature, but honestly, that is not going to work. Why? Because we're in a situation where we have to change the political system. To go to a gold standard, balanced budgets, then a politician can't say, vote for me, I'll take it from this guy and I'll give it to you. That's got to change. You know, Trump is old school thinking. Okay, he's also stood up and said he wants the dollar down. Oh, so I can sell more goods outside the country, they'll be cheaper. Look, I was also called in back in 1985 when they're forming the G5. Same thing, we're going to lower the dollar by 40% to reduce the trade deficit. I wrote to President Reagan. I said, if you do this, you're going to cause a crash within 2 years. Oh, gee, why? You know, that was the 87 crash. Robert Rubin from Goldman Sachs became Treasury Secretary, 1997, starting the same stuff. Oh, the dollar should be down. Created the 97 Asian currency crisis. When you lower the value of a currency, yes, your exports become cheaper, very nice. But so do all the assets in your own country. In the case of the 87 crash, they had sold a third of the national debt of the United States to Japan. You lower the dollar by 40%, they're going to sell. So they don't understand currency. They don't understand how the world economy works. So Trump, in saying, oh, I'm going to put tariffs on, and says, yes, it's true. Before the income tax, the U.S. government funded itself only with tariffs. However, there wasn't this social agenda. There was no Social Security, Medicare, all these things. All right. So you're funding a much smaller government with tariffs. Yes. Okay. That worked. Trying to do that today, not going to work. So all these governments are on this perpetual borrow now, and don't worry, we'll, they never pay off. So the Brics is more of a geopolitical issue than economic. Trying to say, oh, well, we're going to back it by 60% gold. You have to change the political system. All right, you can't continue with this, vote for me and I'll give you that. Bribing the voters. You can't have a fixed exchange rate system and do that, or a gold standard. I mean, that's what brought down Bretton Woods. I mean, I think a 3-year-old with a pocket calculator could have figured that out. You're fixing the dollar at $35 to gold, but then you don't limit the amount of dollars that you're spending. It was the Vietnam War that basically broke the back of Bretton Woods and brought the gold exchange, the gold standard down in 71. You can't fix something on one end and then not limit its quantity on the other. You would think it's common sense. But those in power and government don't do that.
Only a curiosity, you were talking about the currency. One most important news of the last times is born of a lot of a cryptocurrency, meme coin. It's impossible to understand what's happening. It seems to be a shifting in a different world, but it could be the way to change the regime of the democracy, of the the balancing of democracy?
Well, as you know, I live in Florida. We just had 2 hurricanes. All right. Internet and power was down for about 10 days. You couldn't even use a credit card. So much for cryptocurrency. If you wanted something and you didn't have cash, you didn't get it. Again, the cryptocurrency is based upon a conspiracy theory, in my opinion. They blame the central banks. Oh, they create this money, blah, blah, blah. First of all, things have changed. Back in the 1960s, if you had $100 bond from the United States government, you went to the bank and you said, would you lend me $50 on it? The answer was no, it was illegal. So we had this theory that it was less inflationary to borrow than to print, because the debt was, you could not borrow against the debt. But after Bretton Woods collapsed, you can. You want to trade gold futures, you post government T-bills. All right. So the problem with the cryptocurrencies is they blame the central banks, and they're not the fault. The central bank has no power over the fiscal budgets of governments. So the government is the one creating the bulk of the money. It's just debt that pays interest now. There's no real distinction. So, they keep blaming the Federal Reserve or the central banks as if they're it's like somebody shoots somebody and you blame the gun, not the person. Things have changed. The economy has evolved. It's grown. And it's not the same as it was under all the theories. You can search on our site. I knew Paul Volcker. He was one of the Federal Reserve back in 1980. And he wrote a book, and we put it on our site, 1979. It's called Rediscovery of the Business Cycle. When the economy crashed in 1974 after the OPEC embargoes, all right, we ended up with what was called stagflation. The economy was declining, but inflation was actually rising. And basically, Paul wrote that, and he said, he called it Rediscovery of the Business Cycle. And in there he says, Keynesian economics, the new economics, it failed. They knew that back then. Look, I talk to a lot of central banks, and I can tell you that they have no power anymore. The Fed raises interest rates, okay, to stop inflation. It doesn't. Why? Because the government is the biggest borrower in the room. He raises interest rates. Our interest expenditures of the government go up to $1 trillion. So you have, Trump, saying, oh, you should be cutting rates, blah, blah, blah. Not going to happen. All right. It's a different animal. When Keynes came up with that idea in the 30s, U.S. had a balanced budget. So it made sense, raise interest rates. He's affecting us directly. All right. But now the government is the biggest borrower. So if the Fed raises rates, nobody in government says, oh, gee, the central bank wants us to spend less. We better cut our spending. They never say that. So that's why.
From my point of view, I'm not an economist. I try to understand what's happened. But strictly connected to the cryptocurrency, there is the market cap, the valuation of the big tech. We live in a strange world. A crisis debt government and the market and the valuation of a big company that high. So in the last days, a China company show to all the world that it's possible to create some a program application spending a little part of the mountain of investment that we see in the big tech, which is the reality.
Look, when you look at markets, there are always going to be these bubbles. In the 1920s, the bubble was over automobiles. That's going to be the new innovation. Then it was airlines. All right. And 2000 was the dot-com bubble. All right. This one here is overvaluing AI. Oh, this is going to change the world, etc. Then it crashes. All right. People jump on whatever the hot topic is at that point in time. Same thing in Tokyo in 1989. The Russian collapse in 98. They were all buying GKOs out of Russia and thought the IMF would always bail them out, so they would make their 20 to 30% interest, and there was no risk. That all collapsed. This is normal, all right? The overvaluations of AI and the chips. I've been a programmer, since the 60s. There's certain things about AI it's not going to do. All right. You're driving down the road. Somebody just looks like he hesitates. He might want to move out. He starts to move out, but pulls back. All right. Just a subtle little change, something like that. We recognize it. All right. A computer's not going to recognize something along those lines. When I was a hedge fund manager, you have to know, like in a poker game, is the guy bluffing or is he not bluffing? It's a gut feeling sometimes. You have to know that person. All right. And so you're not really going to find an AI computer that's going to pick up all that sort of thing. It can be very good at finding a lot of other things. But look, IBM created, Big Blue, and they promised it was going to cure cancer. It failed. You can't put all this stuff in, shake it up, and expect the computer to figure out something that a human being couldn't do. There's certain things it can do and other things it cannot. And most of this is just hype. And like the internet, okay, fine. Yes, you can buy things delivered to your house off of Amazon faster, and that has affected a lot of small local businesses. But there are other things. You need your haircut, you're not going to be able to get that on Amazon. All right, there's certain things that need physical, people to do something, labor, whatever. The economy is much more complex. And it does shift in it, and it grows. The economist, basically Schumpeter, came up with, he called it the cycle of innovation. Basically that the automobile comes out and it destroys, it's creative destruction. That it destroyed the industry of everybody that made horse and buggies. Okay, they're outdated, gone, go bankrupt, because now everybody's using a car. So he called it basically these business cycles are partly driven by this trend of creative destruction. So we create the internet. Amazon comes up and it does wipe out a lot of small businesses around you. All right. But each time you're going to come out with some new technology, and that's always going to be the case. It's these economic business cycles that are partly created from this wave of creative destruction. Then you have the climate that's in there. Climate changes have been going on for millions of years. That's what even created, great migrations out of Africa, etc. I mean, there's a medieval warming period where they were growing grapes in Britain, So, I mean, the climate has changed. I think the University of Arizona has found out, they track that the tropical area moves up and down. It's not constant. So there are cave pictures from the Saudi Arabian desert that show all lush and animals running around. And that was around probably 10,000 BC. So, I mean, everything, there's a cycle to absolutely everything. We're born, we live, we die. Governments are the same. It's it's complicated. Some are driven by nature, and others by humanity. I can tell you, after working with governments from Asia to Middle East, Europe for over 40 years, my conclusion is simply this. If you take your finger
I totally agree with you, Mr. Armstrong. I think that for me is enough, but I would like to pass the word to Lorenzo.
Yeah.
Lorenzo,
I would like
I
to.
think that's the time for your last question to Mr. Armstrong, because I don't want to waste the time of Mr. Armstrong.
Of course, yeah. Thank you,
It's
Piero.
really precious for us.
That's one thing. Considering thanking you first of all for this beautiful explaining about economics, but there is one thing, Mr. Armstrong, I would really like to ask you to explain to the Italian and European audience. That is your model of economic confidence cycle. That's very interesting. I read something about it, but please explain us. Let us understand, because that's a very interesting solution. I think could interest many people.
Well, I've traced it back from ancient times on. There's basically, we've defined it as 8.6 years, but I even, as I said, even Paul Volcker, and the Fed chairman before him, Arthur Burns, when Bretton Woods fell, he was there, and he even concluded the business cycle always wins. It's complicated because everything's in there, from war to weather. We don't create war when we're all fat and happy. It's when you start to get in hard times, then you want to blame somebody else. So the business cycle is very important from that perspective. We have to understand what this is. It turned basically in May. This current cycle peaked out. I think it was May 7th last year. And within weeks, immediately the central banks began to lower interest rates. We're going into a recessionary period, which will take us into 2028. Most of it is government incompetence that has taken place all along, but it's I'm going to put out a book on it, and tracing it back so you can see. But all the times the business cycle has always won. because everything I think is influenced with it. And I would say that after dealing with governments for 40 years, they never learned from the past because each government changes all the time. So, like, you can take your finger, stick it into a flame of a candle, it burns. Are you going to keep doing it to see if it's going to be different one time? You learn from your mistakes. But collectively, as a society, we do not. This is why history repeats. I've been called into so many different financial crises over the years, all around. And I would say I see there's this one question they never ask. Somebody comes up, oh, this is what we should do. No, never have I seen one government ever ask the question, has this been tried before? Did it work? Simple question. They don't do it. And why they often call me in, I don't really know, because they don't do what I tell them to do. But I mean, I've been called in from, even the Bank of China called me in. There's 97 Asian crisis. I mean, I've been in absolutely every financial debacle you can imagine, and I've seen it firsthand. And governments just do not learn from their past. That's
it.
Why I think we always end up in these events of crashing and burning. It was Karl Marx that started this agenda and saying basically there's a business cycle. I don't like it. If we confiscate everybody's property, that will smooth it out. All right. Keynes basically came up with the same kind of theory. Well, if we use interest rates, we can manipulate society and smooth the business cycle out. Nobody's ever won yet. I'm going to say Arthur Burns said after the collapse of Bretton Woods, the business cycle always wins. Paul Volcker, the next Fed chairman, came out with his book, Rediscovery of the Business Cycle. It's partly, I think it is human nature that maybe every generation has to make the same mistakes. I was in Tokyo doing an institutional session, and this guy bribed his way in. And he came up to me. He was an individual, and he says, "I'm sorry, I just had to talk to you." I said, "What's the problem?" He bought $50 million worth of Japanese stock for the first time in his life, the very day of the high in 1989. So I met the guy that finally bought the high. And I asked him, what made you do that? And he said brokers had called him for 7 years and said that the Japanese share market went up 5% every January. He went in, bought December 31st, expecting to make 5% in January. Here the market's down 30%. He's still holding the same position. So when you have sucked in that last possible buyer, all right, the bubble's done. That's where we're getting with the AI bubble, all this stuff. It always reaches that, crescendo where it just collapses. Governments do the same. So what I would like to see, if you really look at the contemporary accounts, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not have to fight his way to Rome. Why? It was the Senate that fled. All right. Cicero was one of the oligarchs and kept basically saying, oh, Caesar is a dictator, this, whatever. The people cheered Caesar all the way through. Why? Because there was also a debt crisis. Same thing. The senators were the money lenders, etc. But it was a little bit different back then. If you if your house was 200,000 euros and now it's only worth 50,000, they would take the house, but you still owe them the 200. And if you couldn't pay that, they took your children and sold them in slavery. So it was a little bit different of a debt crisis. But this stuff has been going on for a long time. Mark Antony bought Pompey's estate on credit because he thought Caesar was going to wipe out all the debts. So there's always more to these stories than just, looking at the one biased. Cicero was probably the fake news of the ancient world. He only reported what he wanted to report.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Mr. Armstrong. Lorenzo, I have a question for you. It's a surprise. Lorenzo, where are you?
Tell me.
Are you online?
I am.
I'm asking. I think we are talking with Mr. Armstrong, but I think that we have to manage a meeting, a forum in Italy with Mr. Armstrong. I'd like to make him know to all the people, Mr. Armstrong.
Yeah.
I think that it could be a good thing. Next time that you'll be in Italy, I'd like to manage some meeting with you. I promise that I'll take you in my wonderful Sicily that I know that you love so much. The same stuff, taking you all around our wonderful Italy is a good proposal. It's possible.
Italy is one of my favorite places. I was just there last year, actually, when took my family off to Rome. Now, I've been going to Italy for since I was 13.
That's perfect. So you know pretty well, so we can really join here together. This would be amazing.
I would, if we understand what is bringing our problems, then I believe that we have a good shot at changing government. That's what Caesar did. That's what the American Revolution was about. The French governments get abusive and inefficient. And then you got to redesign them and start over again. We're coming into that. I think, by 2032, we're going to have to say, okay, fine, this is all messed up. Borrowing every year with no intention of paying back. I mean, come on, a 3-year-old with a pocket calculator could figure out this is not going to work. But politicians will not fix something, and if it's not broken. And I've just learned over the years, I could walk in and say, listen, if we don't do this, 25 million people will die tomorrow. And they'll say, well, maybe you're wrong. They'd rather have to be seen, vote for me, I'll get the guy that did it. They're not interested in proactive. Government, if I run for election, say I saved your job, you would have been, lost your job, but I saved it. And you're going to look at me, well, how do I know? It's better you lose your job and then say, vote for me, I'll get the guy that did it. That's the way government works. They're not interested in preventing a crisis. They only like crises. And that's why a lot of people say they benefit from every crisis that happens.
That's true. Definitely. Thank you so much. Piero,
okay.
It's up to you, the honor to close this beautiful interview.
No, perfect. Really. I really love that. I thanks a lot, Mr. Armstrong. It's always a pleasure, a big pleasure to spend. has been a good idea. And I know that Mr. Armstrong will come back with us when you have your time. I really appreciate to spend my time with you.
Well, thank you very much. As you know, my grandfather's from Palermo.
It's great.
I love it. Thanks a lot, and hello everybody. We'll see you again, and follow armstrongeconomics.com. It's important.
Thank you very much.